Thank you. So my name is Héléna Verbeeck, and I'm now a postdoctoral researcher at Ghent University in the Sustainable Material Science team, led by Professor Kim Verbeeck and Professor Inge Bellemans. But this work on developing an MD-informed structure property model for self-diffusion coefficients in these ternary calcium oxide alumina silica slags actually started very much at the beginning of my PhD. So I started my PhD in 2021, and the focus was to develop a phase field model within a pyrometallurgical context, so a microstructural evolution model. And one of the main subsystems I was looking at was the alumina dissolution in these ternary slags. But very early on, it became obvious that one of the biggest hurdles was the lack of kinetic data in oxide melts. I could determine the thermodynamic driving force from databases like those developed by FactSage here, but there was not a lot of kinetic data available in the literature. So I looked at the work of my predecessors in our group, and the main data source used in previous phase field models actually all came back to this one study of 1977, where they did determine the interdiffusivity matrix of this ternary system, but for one specific composition over a pretty limited temperature range. So when I wanted to apply that input data to the slag compositions I was interested in, it was actually pretty far from the compositions I wanted to study. So having, I see that the visuals all got a little bit messed up. I hope it doesn't disturb the rest of the presentation, but yeah, so having my expertise mainly in a computational background, we were wondering whether we could fill this gap using a pure computational approach. So therefore, we resorted to molecular dynamics. So this is a modeling technique that can simulate the movement of atoms over time by solving Newton's second law for an assembly of atoms that interact through a given force field. So this graph we already saw by Moritz, but I am really much interested in how this force field works, because that force field that dictates, allows us to calculate the forces between the atoms that dictate how they move throughout the system. And by doing these molecular dynamic simulations, we can simulate the movement of these atoms, from which we can extract the self-diffusion coefficients. So as I said, I was really interested in the force field, so we needed to do a benchmarking study on the force fields available in the literature to see which ones best describe the behavior of this ternary slag system. So based on benchmarks on structural and transport properties, we selected Buhaja's force field, Buhaja's potential, and this we used to perform 119 MD calculations over 40 compositions and 5 temperatures. So for each of the red crosses on these phase diagrams, we did the simulations. So we selected these points by the criteria that the simulations must all be performed above the liquidus, and the viscosity, the estimated viscosity by using the FactSage viscosity module must be below 10 Pascal seconds, because if the melt would become too viscous, the whole slag moves too slowly, and we would need too much computational power, too long simulations to get reliable results. So for now, we already did simulations for 50 nanoseconds, which is a lot within the MD community, but that allowed us to really get a statistical view on the dynamics of the system. So for all these red crosses, we did the simulations, and this is the data we ended up with. So we could really extract from the MD simulations the self-diffusion coefficients of all species present in our ionic melt, so from the calcium ions, aluminium ions, silicium ions, and oxygen ions separately, and get this very dense data set as a function of temperature and composition. But now we had a lot of data, but ultimately, I wanted to simulate how alumina dissolves in this ternary slag. So we needed to find a way how to use these independent data points to get a continuous description. So therefore, we needed to parameterize all these independent data points to get a continuous description. We needed to do a parametrization. But we really wanted to do this in a physically informed way. So not just doing any fitting, but we looked into the literature and we decided to adopt the structure property model that was previously presented by Thibodeau and Jung. And in this model, it adopts an Arrhenius expression, and the activation energy really takes into account the structure of the slag, and it does this describes the self-diffusivity as a function of temperature and the pair fractions of the network-forming cations in the melt. So these pair fractions we obtained from the FactSage database, from the FT-Oxid database, and we use them as input in our expression. And then we actually adopted two approaches for the fitting. On the one hand, we exclusively used our MD dataset, which is a very dense dataset over as a function of temperature and composition. But we also adopted a second approach, where we not only used our MD data, which gives a very nice self-diffusivity surface, but we combined it also with experimental data. There was not a lot available, but still it could give us a small tweak towards what was experimentally determined so that it was not exclusively computational. So those were the two approaches. We did the fitting and we could now get two nicely continuous expressions. So then we got our input where we were actually looking for at the beginning of my PhD, and we could actually validate these two fitting approaches by comparing it to experiments. So what we did was we used this input to perform three-dimensional phase field simulations of alumina, but also of silica dissolution in this ternary melt. And we did these three-dimensional simulations, and we compared them to experiments, CSLM experiments, confocal selective laser melting experiments on the dissolution to get a better view on our results. Now, first, we did the simulations also using the initial kinetic data to see where we were starting from, what was there in the beginning, and how does our reparameterization actually improves, or like that was what we were hoping, that it would improve our agreement. So that were our initial results with the initial data point. And what we saw was that there was a very different behavior for the alumina versus the silica slag, which also reflects the very different part of the phase diagram that we were crossing through for the slag during the simulations. So this was were our initial simulations, and these were now the new results that we could obtain with the two approaches, with the MD only and with the hybrid approach. Now, what can we actually learn from this, or how do we interpret these results? Well, first of all, it is important to notice that the dissolution time of the experiments is always smaller than the ones that we simulated with our MD-based approaches. Now, I think it's important to acknowledge how difficult it is to perform high-temperature experiments. It's impossible to do purely diffusion-controlled dissolution experiments because there will always be some kind of convection. The particle will move around a bit, so it's never purely diffusion-controlled. So that's why we did expect that the experiments would predict a smaller dissolution time than our simulations. So that's actually why we thought, like, okay, then this initial data point, it would actually not be possible that we would simulate faster dissolution than the experiments predict. But then a second important part was, so the deviation between our experiments and our simulations, we thought at least partially, we think we could give an explanation based on convection. It's not the full picture, but at least it will play a part in this. But then what we also saw is that the use of this composition and temperature dependent data really improves experimental agreement. So with the initial data point, we get very different behavior, whether, based on which part of the phase diagram we're crossing. So especially here for the silica dissolution experiments, we really got a strong improvement by doing by this new MD-informed fitting. So this teaches us that a full computational approach allows us to make reasonable predictions now. Here, for this ternary slag system, we were lucky there were some experiments in the literature allowing us to benchmark and validate our results, but it's also promising for other slag systems where often there are not too many experiments, good dissolution experiments available, but it at least gives us a hint that this MD approach could allow us to predict new data. Now, also, I said we cared a lot about the force field, so we selected Buhadja's force field, which was the best that is currently available in the literature, but we also know that it's not perfect. It was not designed specifically for transport properties, so there is still definitely room for improvement regarding force field development within oxide systems. So for future work, force field reparameterization could really be a priority, but it would also be very interesting to see how machine learning potentials would perform in this field, because that's really an emerging field that could be quite promising, but where it has not really been applied to ionic melts yet. There has been some work regarding glasses that is very promising, so it would be nice to see to also test this for the ionic melts. Then, of course, from the phase field side, the incorporation of convection would be very interesting as well to test our hypotheses that part of the underestimation comes from convection. But then a final point was that, okay, it is quite promising for self-diffusion coefficients. How would it work? Could we try to apply it to other transport properties of slags as well? And that's now been the topic of my postdoctoral research that I started in January. So now we started collaborating with the Center of Molecular Modeling at the UGent, who developed a post-processing tool called STACY, a stable autocorrelation integral estimator that allows us, by only post-processing, to extract multiple transport properties from one molecular dynamic simulation. So now, besides self-diffusivity coefficients, we can also extract ionic electrical conductivity, thermal conductivity, and viscosity from MD simulations. Now, what's important for the STACY post-processing module as well is that it now allows, by its whole mathematical treatment, to also give a reliable error estimate on your simulated property, something that previously is pretty difficult, or was pretty difficult to do within the MD community. And it also allows us to estimate how long our simulations must be to get this reliable estimate. And this points for ionic melts, which are quite viscous, towards the 10 nanosecond and longer simulations, which is interesting to see because in the literature previously, MD simulations on slags only ran simulations for 1 nanosecond often. So that's often too short to really get a reliable estimate. So here I can show you some preliminary results. We're still in the stage of benchmarking our force fields, but at least for the binary systems, now we are trying to see what trends we can see. I say they're still to be optimized, but we're trying to see, or what we are ultimately working towards is to also provide the structure property models for these other systems as well. So for viscosity, we can benchmark against the viscosity module from FactSage, which is a quite mature model. But for ionic electrical conductivity, there is a model in the literature, but it's fitted on very limited experimental data. And for thermal conductivity, we don't have a reliable structure property model yet. So ultimately, the goal of our team is I can provide with the MD simulations a dense data set, but luckily I also have very talented experimental colleagues that can help to really develop these hybrid models. Arthur on thermal conductivity and Karel on viscosity, working hard in the lab. And together, I think we can unravel part of this structural property relation for all these properties by combining both experiments and MD simulations to get these physically informed structural property models. So I'll end with the key takeaways of my presentation. So molecular dynamics, we really believe that it can enable quantitative kinetic modeling of these ternary melts. It also allows efficient sampling of the composition and temperature space to produce dense data sets for model development. For self-diffusivity, the Thibodeau-Jung model quite nicely captures the key structural property relationship governing the melt behavior. And by doing this MD-informed parameterization, we can improve the agreement with experimental dissolution kinetics in these for alumina and silica. And in the future, we really want to work on further developments in predictive accuracy through force field reparameterization. And then finally, we believe that MD can provide a promising pathway for extending our structure property models for different transport properties in oxide melts. Thank you for your attention.